Hello everyone, this is Nathan Lindorf with Rational Independent. Today we're going to be bringing you two cases from the front page of Reddit r/politics. One talking about Donald Trump, the other one talking about Joe Biden. As is often the case, there's a little bit of bias in these articles. Let's see if we can spot the bias as we dig in. First one, which I think exemplifies the Trump dynamic in the media, so that's why I want to talk about it. From Rolling Stone, Trump says January 6th was an insurrection. The former president contradicted his lawyers by describing the day's events as an attempt to overthrow the government caused by Nancy Pelosi. All right, so let's just get a handle on what we're talking about here. Supreme Court today heard arguments on whether or not states can throw Donald Trump off the 2024 presidential ballots if they determine he violated the 14th Amendment, which essentially disqualifies insurrectionists from holding office. I always find it interesting to see the way people frame a complex legal question, because your framing of the question is very instructive as to how you see it. So here, the way they're saying it is fairly straightforward. But basically, the idea that they're saying is, I think the heart of the matter that's being described, though, is can states enforce the 14th Amendment without there being existing congressional legislation associated with it? I think, based on my reading of it, the answer is no. But the left doesn't agree, obviously, because that's why they're trying to do this. So, the former president shouldn't be too worried because, of course, it's the conservative-controlled court. It seems unlikely to permit this pretty daunting consequence. So, during arguments, Trump lawyer Jonathan Mitchell rejected the notion that the violent assault on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021 qualified as an insurrection. This was a riot. It was not an insurrection. And I think when it comes to legal wrangling, it actually makes sense to basically address the issue within the context of where you're at. If you're arguing in front of the Supreme Court, you're not arguing in the media, you're not trying to set a political narrative, you're not trying to describe the broader overarching cultural issues. You're trying to defend your client, Donald Trump, against the premise that states are removing him because he committed an insurrection. If you can remove the decision, if you can help the court see that it was not an insurrection, if there was no insurrection, then he didn't commit insurrection, then the 14th Amendment doesn't apply and the whole case evaporates. So that's why they're targeting in this particular way, and they're making a factual claim. They're saying stuff happened. By stuff, there was violence there. There was a very rowdy demonstration. There were thousands of people. There was trespassing, there was breaking glass, there was injuries, there was even a few deaths, although not at the hands of the crowd. But regardless, it was definitely a disruption of the peace. It was definitely a breakdown of civil order. All of that is totally legit, true. That's happened. It's on video. But was it an insurrection? For people who are making the claim that Donald Trump committed an insurrection on January 6th and therefore should be able to be removed from the ballot, you have to not only ascertain these are the facts, these are the events that actually happened, and a lot of people agree, yes, the Capitol was breached, there were people there, blah, blah, blah. But you then have to say this was an attempt to overthrow the government directed by Donald Trump. So it was more than just a riot. It was actually a coordinated effort by a group of people to overthrow, to the language in the Constitution talks about bearing arms against, well, that might not be in the Constitution. Where did I hear that? I think that was from actually a lawyer arguing that it was an insurrection. Sorry. Again, not an expert here, but I try and be careful with my facts. Armed insurrection against the government means that you have taken up weapons and you want to fight the legitimate police authorities, military authority of the established government and try and overthrow it. you have to show that that was happening. And then further, if you want to eliminate Donald Trump from the ballot, you then have to show that Donald Trump had a material role in that insurrection. And I think as far as a fine gradation, but a valuable one, if you're arguing in front of the Supreme Court, making the case to say, this was a riot. We can all agree that this violence happened, but it wasn't an insurrection. So I'm okay with that. Trump's legal team also tried to throw cold water on the idea, writing that it was not an insurrection, as they did not involve an organized attempt to overthrow or resist the U.S. government. That's what I'm saying. If you want to have findings related to an insurrection, you have to prove insurrection happened, which is more than just violence. If you look at Antifa, if you look at Black Lives Matter, you can point to dozens of examples right around the same time, the summer before, all around the nation, where there were riots and looting and violence and terrible things that happened. No one claims that was an insurrection. They were riots. There's a difference. And then, of course, we need to make Donald Trump appear unreasonable. And this is where we talk about taking him literally instead of seriously. Trump disagrees, apparently. They kept saying about what I said right after the insurrection, he said. I think it was an insurrection caused by Nancy Pelosi. Okay. This is Donald Trump being a troll. This is a laugh line for people who are, for those of you who can't stand Trump, for those of people who support Donald Trump, they hear him say this and they laugh because he's pointing out the absurdity of ignoring one political side's actions and focusing with a microscope on only the other side. He's using hyperbole and an extreme example to show other things that might happen outside of the narrative framing. He's not making a factual statement. He's saying that this was a disruption in the order of government and that those who were responsible for keeping order around Capitol Hill, which would be Nancy Pelosi, took actions to make Capitol Hill more vulnerable to riot and disruption and other sorts of weirdness, and therefore they have a role in the events. If you can't see that, then you have Trump derangement syndrome. This is the dynamic in the media. You get people who hear Donald Trump and they go, what? He's arguing with what his lawyers are saying. They said it's not an insurrection. He says it is an insurrection. No, he's poking fun at the establishment and Nancy Pelosi. You may not agree with his factual claim. You may think he's off base, but he's a savvy political operator and he says things that makes his supporters like him more, include using a little bit of humor to poke fun at the various somber, serious media framing that says, this is the box we're allowed to consider, and in it, all white Christian conservative men are bad, and all the beautiful rainbow people outside of it are virtuous and wonderful and good. It's silly, and it's totally valid to lampoon that. Trump's logic here doesn't likely extend beyond believing insurrection is a bad word Democrats say about him, so he's going to say it back about them. Again, taking him literally or taking him seriously. If you take him seriously, then he's a political candidate arguing, using humor and hyperbole to try and break the media framing of this conversation and point out that the people who were in charge of Capitol Hill have a role in keeping the peace around Capitol Hill. That's plenty of logic. But they say, no, they don't have a logic. That's not really an insurrection. He must be so dumb that he just thinks that that's a bad word. And they use it against him, so he's going to turn around. I know you are, but what am I? Kind of that playground level insult. The idea that the then House Speaker Pelosi perpetrated an insurrection on January 6th doesn't make a lick of sense, of course. There's zero evidence she had anything to do with the attack on the Capitol, and it's flat out absurd to think she would have been incentivized in any way to marshal a mob of people waving Trump flags to disrupt the certification of a fellow Democrat's election win. Have you ever heard of the idea of lies by omission? Have you ever heard the idea of negligence? If you have a role in keeping the peace and you stand down and you prevent the people who would suppress this kind of riot and keep it in the normal bounds of political speech, if you prevent them from doing their job, then you have a role in the violence that comes out after that. Without summoning mobs, without marshaling people, or it's so specious that if you have the willingness to just look at the facts, you can see that there's validity here. You can see that there's an arguable case, that there is merit to what's being discussed here. Framing this as either you were the one to actively recruit the violent people to come in and that's the only way that you can have a role in what happened is so specious as to be almost just childish, just stupid on purpose. Is there a word for that? Obtuse, that's the word. They're being obtuse. All right, so that's Rolling Stone. Very brave, wonderful coverage about how Donald Trump has finally admitted January 6th was an insurrection, because that's not a misleading clickbait headline. All right, and here we go. This is going to be fun. Second article, The New Republic. Just say it, Democrats. Biden has been a great president. His achievements have been nothing short of historic. That is a creepy photo. Oh, that is a creepy photo. Okay, we're moving past the creepy. Okay. A plea to my Democratic friends. It's time to start calling Joe Biden a great president. Not a good one. Not a better choice than Donald Trump. Joe Biden is a historically great president. Say it with passion, backed by the conviction that it's true. Because it is. Well, this is a fun opinion piece. By the way, I looked down at the bottom. This is some dude I've never heard of, former Republican consultant, now part of the Lincoln Project, which makes him a never-Trumper. So shockingly, he's writing an article talking about how Joe Biden is great when Joe Biden is the opponent of Donald Trump, and he's an opponent of Donald Trump. So there you go. Okay. Don't base the campaign on the contrast between, so we're casting Donald Trump as an erratic thug under indictment in multiple states, and Joe Biden is a normal, stable president. Okay, that might be a bit of a stretch, but let's see. Let's let him make the case for Joe Biden. Okay, shouldn't just make the case Donald Trump shouldn't be president. That's not the reason Joe Biden should be reelected. Okay, his historic level of achievement here at home. Achievement of what? Go ahead, make the case. While standing on the side of freedom versus tyranny in the largest land war in Europe since World War II, a role no American president has played since the Roosevelt-Truman era, be bold, walk into this campaign with swagger and confidence and pride. Okay, I'm just going to say it. Ukraine is not a virtuous victim. Ukraine has plenty of corruption and issues. It should have right to its sovereign borders. Making it part of NATO is problematic. That's minimum. That's a problematic solution. Not making it part of NATO, we're effectively fighting a proxy war where we are holding up Ukraine to fight against Russia, as Russia is the aggressor and has invaded. I'm not saying Russia's virtuous in this. But what you're dealing with is old school artillery, shelling, RPGs, tanks on the ground, civilian casualties, all in the land of Ukraine, which is killing so many innocent people. And it is ravaging that country. And I guarantee you, there are business interests who are salivating over the government contracts that are going to come because as soon as the war is over, there's going to be a pitch for a Marshall Plan-esque spending spree for the U.S. to pay to rebuild Ukrainian infrastructure. In case you didn't realize this, the people that interact in this space are chess players. They're looking 2, 3, 4 steps down the road. Right now, the media narrative is about the virtuous Ukraine who's being put upon by the aggressor Russia. But the fact of the matter is, if you frame it that way and you get the U.S. to start writing checks, then if you sell guns, bombs, bullets, food, etc., you can make a lot of money. And then after the war is over, you can make even more money rebuilding the war-torn country. Just saying, follow the money. So one, this is not a virtuous versus, these are two bad guys, basically, fighting it out. Secondly, just writing checks is not virtuous. The US has not committed troops to Ukraine, thank goodness. We are not in a direct war with Russia. Russia is a regional player. If you want to talk about real threats to America, let's talk about China. China is a much larger strategic threat than Russia is. But you'll notice that the language is all about how Russia is the big bad guy. And the media is pretty quiet about China. Wonder why that could be. Follow the money. Anyway, all we're doing is supplying military equipment and money. And the Ukrainians are doing the fighting. So props to them, to their brave soldiers, for standing and defending their country. It's amazing that they're holding together and they didn't get steamrolled. It's fantastic for their military. That is a tremendous accomplishment. It doesn't mean that they're not going to end up with a ravaged country and likely a negotiated peace at some point. The idea that Ukraine is going to push Russia all the way out of Ukraine and seize all of the borders as they were before, I'm going to say something inconvenient, before Obama allowed the annexation of Crimea, which happened before Donald Trump, because history didn't start with Donald Trump. Kind of got to pay attention. Just a suggestion. Anyway, it's not virtuous just to write checks. It's not inherently virtuous, but they're claiming that it is. Okay, so in making the case for Joe Biden, we have he's committed a lot of money to Ukraine. Okay. Now we have a question about how, as a political calculation, who can beat who. It's political complex BS. Same class of people who thought Bill Clinton was dead. Blah, blah, blah. Stop the nonsense. It's only a weak opponent. Trump isn't weak. I thought you were going to make the case that Joe Biden was a great president. No, Donald Trump is going to win. The Republican care more about Donald Trump. Whining about a Trump-Biden choice that only helps Trump. It gets about the business of uniting behind a great president. Okay, again, you're making the claim that he's a great president. So far, all you've claimed is he's committed a bunch of money to Ukraine. All right? There's not much I admire about the modern Republican Party. I thought you were making a case for Joe Biden. But I find myself wishing Democrats could learn from their eagerness to unite behind a candidate and echo a consistent message. If a Republican president had a record remotely equaling the Biden record, you haven't laid out the Biden record. The only debate among Republicans would be if he should be called one of the greatest presidents or simply the greatest. Okay, some Final Fantasy football pick, excuse me. The worst and most dangerous president U.S. history will win again in November. Again, being a never-Trumper, you can tell he is just anxious to roll out that invective, those attacks on Trump. But the thesis of your article is that Biden is a great president. So make the case that Biden is a great president. Worked on a Republican campaign. The Democratic Party is the only pro-democracy party in America. That's actually true in the sense that tyrants like democracy because they can use the mob to rule. That's the reason why democracies are not stable. That's the reason why we're not a democracy. So when you say you're the pro-democracy party, what you're saying is you're anti-constitutional, which I agree. The Democratic Party has many policy positions that are anti-constitutional. Just throwing that out there. Okay, but guys, why do so many of you have this need to act like ungrateful children of wealthy parents, impossible to please and always demanding more? Name a president who's accomplished as much in his first term. Okay, so we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 paragraphs in, and we've said one nice thing about Biden. not about Trump, Democratic Party, Republican Party, whatever. Your thesis is Biden is a great president. 9 paragraphs in. The stock market is hitting record highs. That doesn't mean anything in and of itself. Unemployment is at a record low with 14 million new jobs. Okay, well, setting aside the fact that the 14 million is basically a statistical asterisk, because it has to do with basically jobs that were suspended during COVID coming back. When the government bans employers from functioning in the marketplace and then lifts that ban and allows them to function, the government should not get credit for creating jobs that they effectively eliminated a few months before. Just a thought. Unemployment is at a record low. Well, it's pretty equivalent. It's within a couple, tenths of a percentage of where it was pre-COVID under Trump. So that's a wash. We talked about this earlier. Talking to small business owners, the biggest problem they are facing is finding workers who are willing to work for what they can afford to pay, because inflation has totally screwed up the labor price market. Just throwing that out there. I'm old enough to remember when the left was agitating for $15 minimum wage. Guess what? Congratulations. Most companies, even fast food places, pay $15 an hour, give or take. Do you know why? Because everything is inflated so much that that's now kind of a baseline figure what they need to pay in order to attract workers. And that's also why if you go to Wendy's and you get a lunch meal, it's $13 per person for lunch at Wendy's. Do you think maybe that has a little to do with inflation? I wonder if they'll mention inflation as why, making the case why Joe Biden is so great. Okay? This next sentence, I don't really understand, but let's go ahead and see if we can understand it. A child born in the first Republican infrastructure week would have been entering grade school by the time President Biden passed the largest public spending initiative in American history. So apparently, Infrastructure Week was some kind of Trump initiative when he was president. Okay, whatever. So I think what he's saying, the really tortured analogy, is that within 5 years of Donald Trump's initiative of Infrastructure Week, President Biden, I guess they're giving him credit for doing infrastructure? Passed the largest public spending initiative in American history. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just throw this out there. Spending money by the government is not inherently virtuous. It can have good effects. It can have negative effects. It can have both and be a balancing act between how much you're harming over here and helping over here. But just because as president you signed a bill where the Congress authorized spending a whole bunch of money, that's not an accomplishment. Balance the budget. That'd be an accomplishment. Okay, as a Republican media consultant, I made hundreds of ads about the high cost of prescription drugs, but it took President Biden to give Medicare the power to directly negotiate with Big Pharma to lower prices and cap the cost of insulin for Medicare beneficiaries at $35. Okay, so let me review what he's offering as accomplishments. The stock market did some stuff, whether or not he's responsible for that. Unemployment is at a record low, pretty equivalent to when Donald Trump was president. 14 million new jobs, basically COVID restart. Small business owners are having trouble finding workers because the labor market pricing is all screwed up. Within 5 years of Donald Trump's presidency, President Biden spent a bunch of money. Not an accomplishment. The easiest thing in the world for the government to spend money. And it took President Biden to enact price controls, because we all know how well price controls help the economy. Here's an idea. If you cap the cost, if you cap the price that companies can provide a good or service, you are going to impact the availability of that good or service. If a business needs to pay $40 per dose for insulin and they can only charge $35, that business is going to get out of the business of producing insulin and selling it to the market, because you cannot make up a loss on volume. You cannot operate a business at a loss. Price controls operate in this weird government fugue state where we say, it's like we're Jedis going, these are not the drug prices you're looking for. You can't just hand wave away reality. Stuff that's valuable costs money to produce it. If you can't sell it for more than it cost you to produce it, you're not going to sell it. You're going to go somewhere else looking to sell something that's profitable. That's how the market works. But there's this crazy idea that if we just had price controls, we could fix everything. For all the bitching about gas prices, the United States is now producing more oil than any country in history. Well, I don't think it's so much bitching about gas prices, which are kind of a function of inflation raging, which is a valid thing to complain about. I think it's more to do with the fact that the United States government is getting in the way of oil and gas production. They are doing things that make it harder to produce energy domestically. And that's what most of the people that I see on the right are actually complaining about. The government, regulation, getting in the way, increasing costs. All of those things make it more difficult to produce energy at an economic price point that makes sense here domestically, which means that we ship that energy in and support tyrants overseas and greater environmental impact. Again, which is a greater environmental impact? Having something produced in Canada that can be pipelined down to a refinery in America, pipelines being the most efficient and least environmentally damaging way of transporting large amounts of oil and gas, or support a Middle East dictatorship that pumps it out of the ground, sticks it in a tanker, and floats it halfway across the world. Which one's going to cause more spills? Which one's going to cause more issues? Which one's going to feed autocratic regimes we don't want to support? Seems pretty clear to me. And yet one of the first things Joe Biden did was kill the Keystone XL pipeline. Said, oh, we can't have that because it's better for the environment if we ship the stuff by train. Pipelines make it worse. Again, the whole thing falls apart as soon as you look at it. Okay. It's one of the reasons gas prices are now lower in inflation-adjusted dollars than in 1974. Yeah, it's amazing how things look. If you control for inflation, you can say, wow, look, gas is cheap. Except inflation has destroyed your ability to produce an income. Whatever. Anyway, moving on. I know fossil fuels suck. Well, that's an interesting acknowledgement. And the world should run on solar power. That's utterly a silly, that's that sentence right there. Yeah, I know fossil fuels suck and the world should run on solar power. That is a writer signaling, I have no interest in reality. I have no interest in looking at facts. I want to put out political spin that sounds good and feels good and has no bearing on reality. When I read a sentence like that, basically that's the author saying, hi, I'd like to take a second and discredit myself so you can safely ignore me now. That is a nonsense statement. And of course, Biden administration launched a $7 billion solar power investment project. Spending money is not virtuous. Okay, what's most amazing is that Biden got this done in a world in which the majority of Republicans believe he is not a legal president. And 4 years before that, if you asked the majority of Democrats if they thought Trump was a legal, valid president, you'd get the same dynamic. Contesting elections is it's not just a current phenomenon. It happens, especially if you do things to undermine the credibility of our election system. I'll just put it there. Okay, members of Congress and senators who don't just agree with your boss, they think he's an illegitimate president. Again, shoe was on the other foot just a few years ago. Wake up and show some gratitude. You wanted student loan forgiveness. You got it for 3 million borrowers, except it was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, which means that if that's not an accomplishment, That's an anti-constitutional, big government power overreach that's completely not appropriate and deemed to be effectively illegal, which is why it didn't actually happen, particularly on the broad scale that Joe Biden wanted. You wanted a president who would finally pass gun safety legislation. You got the most comprehensive bill in nearly 30 years. Okay, the Constitution supports individual gun ownership. If you are anti-individual law-abiding citizen gun ownership, then you're an anti-constitutional party. Or, as they said earlier, America's only pro-democracy party, the Democratic Party. So here you go. You are providing evidence that you are antagonistic to the Constitution. Okay. You said it, not me. Maybe you're a Democrat who actually cares about the federal deficit, unlike the Republicans who fake concern. Since Biden took office, the deficit has decreased by $1.7 trillion. How far? Okay, we're near the end. We're going to put a pin in that. We're going to come back to deficits in a second. Okay, I could go on citing the achievements of a president who actually cares about governing. He doesn't even know where he is most days. He's clearly has cognitive decline. He gets confused all the time. These days, his favorite thing is to invent meetings that he's had recently with world leaders who have been dead or out of power for not just years, but in some cases, decades. It's a little concerning. Just throwing that out there. I'm not sure how much you can care about governing if you don't even remember what years you were vice president. Just throwing that out there. Okay. All these actions and numbers are important. He's restored stability and decency to the presidency. Joe Biden has made governing boring and predictable. Both fundamental rights of the people in a healthy democracy. We're not a democracy. I'll never tire of saying it, as much as they'll tire of trying to convince us that we are. And can you look at the last 3 years or so and say, yeah, it's felt really boring and predictable, like the adults are back in charge and everything's running smoothly. Has that been your experience the last few years? All years are not created equal. There's every reason to believe that 2024 will be a year like 1944, a hinge in history. A dark shadow has fallen over America and Europe. President Joe Biden is fulfilling the role of the greatest American president, rallying support in America and abroad for the fundamental values that make America more than a place on the map with a flag. Without President Biden, a monstrous evil would be violently spreading in Europe. At a time when one of the two major parties in the world's only superpower has embraced autocracy, citation needed, because I think what he's saying is that Republicans have, it comes back to this weird projection argument where the leftist media is making the claim that the Republicans are fascists now. If you support Donald Trump, then you want a dictatorship in America. That's the case they're making. We've debunked it a few times. It's a mess. But he's just assuming you already agree with that and saying, that's where we are. Joe Biden has stood firm, unflinchingly calling out those who may be Americans by accident of birth, but not belief. So now, if you support Donald Trump, then you don't deserve to be called an American. Then you're only an American because you happen to be born here. You don't support American values and principles. Them's fighting words. That's a problem. If you want civil war, that's how you get civil war. Just throwing that out there. President Biden understands that an optimistic embrace of the future has defined America, that hope and confidence in a better tomorrow is the premise that embodies the best of America. This is greatness. This is a president keeping true to the legacy of the greatest generation who rose to defend the gift of democracy that Republicans now squander. You notice something that's missing in this whole article that's praising Joe Biden? There isn't a single Joe Biden quote in it at all. There's no stirring speech that he gave that resonated with the American people that shared a sense of leadership and vision and passion for the future that he's ascribing to Joe Biden, he can't point to a single circumstance where Joe Biden actually did that. What he's pointed to is that Joe Biden has exercised unconstitutional direct controls over the marketplace and spent a bunch of money. Those are not historic accomplishments or achievements. He's making the claim that Joe Biden has restored decency and honor and respect to the presidency as an institution and as a person. He's embodied this positive vision of leadership. But he hasn't pointed to a single example where Biden has done that. Because this is a story he's telling about Biden, not what Biden has actually done. Yes, Joe Biden is a great American president. Be proud of this president, Democrats. Be proud that you live at a time when America needs you to rise to her defense. None of us can choose history, but history chooses us. When America once again needed a quiet American hero, Joe Biden has met the moment. Now it is up to the rest of us not to falter. Certainty and conviction will bring victory, while doubt and hesitation invite defeat. This is what the left cares about. This is the vision of the world that they want to see. Now let's just talk about the deficit, because they like to toss out that Joe Biden is somehow fiscally responsible because he's reduced the deficit by 1.7 trillion. So real quick, 30 seconds. Deficits and debt are two different things. Debt is the overall amount owed. Deficit is the rate at which the amount that you owe is going up. So if you have a deficit, it means that you are spending more than you make. That's a bad thing, generally speaking. If you used to overspend by 3 trillion and now you overspend by 1.3 trillion, you've reduced the deficit by 1.7 trillion, but you're still deficit spending. You're not being fiscally responsible. But let's look at the deficits. Well, that was shockingly hard to find, but all right. So from fiscaldata.treasury.gov, I think that's a pretty legit source. 2023, this most recent year of data, under Joe Biden, the deficit was 1.7 trillion. Now, let's look right here, okay? 2016, total deficit, 0.59 trillion, which is still a lot of money. 0.67, 0.78, going up for sure, 0.98. So the first 3 years of Trump were all under $1 trillion federal deficit. Then you have COVID, let's blow out the spending, which was a terrible decision. Both parties own it. It's a mess. I didn't like it. It is what it is. But COVID has a huge amount of deficit spending, okay? 3.3 trillion, not in spending, in a deficit, meaning that we spent that much over the revenue that we collected that year. Now, Biden likes to brag that he brought the deficit down, that he's, in fact, not just Biden, but his surrogates in the article. He's a fiscally responsible president because he reduced it by 1.7 trillion. Well, where do we get that argument? Okay, so this is $500 billion. Oh, look at that. From 3.13 to 1.38. That's pretty close to 1.7 trillion. So over the 2 years from COVID to 2022, we went down by 1.7 trillion. Now, for the slow kids in the back, this is the lowest deficit that Biden has had in his whole term. The next year, back up to 1.7. You know what both of these post-COVID numbers have that are in common? They're both higher than the highest deficit Trump had pre-COVID. This is how federal government expansion works. This is what the federal government does. They spend money like it's going out of style, and they claim virtue when they do it. Anyway, hopefully you gathered a few things from this. Hopefully it was not terribly uninteresting. Either way, this is my Red Rant for today. This is Nathan Lindorf with The Rational Independent. Good luck out there.